As we get started, the title of our next panel is Education Reform Efforts and the Path to Educational Success. Moderating this panel today is Dr. Michael McShane, and he is a research fellow in education policy studies at the American Enterprise Institute. He is co-author of President Obama and Education Reform, the Personal and the Political, published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2012. His scholarship has been published by Education Finance and Policy and in various technical reports. He has contributed to more popular publications such as Education Next, the Huffington Post, National Review, the Chronicle of Higher Education, and the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. He is co-editor of the forthcoming book, Common Core Meets the Reform Agenda, with Frederick Hess, also, I believe, of AEI, correct? Yes, he has spoken at the Rumi Forum. Slated to be published by Teachers College Press in late 2013, he began his career as an inner-city high school teacher in Montgomery, Alabama. Please welcome Dr. McShane.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon, everybody. Playing the moderator here, I'm just going to try and get out of the way of the great panels that we have today. So I think we should just kick it off right off the bat. So our first presenter today is Mary Ann Stinson, who's the principal of Truesdale Education Campus, a District of Columbia public school, and she's presenting a paper or presentation titled "Assessing Student Achievement and School Performance in the Light of Recent Education Reform Efforts." So please take it away.
Thank you, Dr. McShane, and good afternoon, everybody. Hands off the mic. So I am Mary Ann Stinson. I'm the principal of Truesdale Education Campus. We are an education campus in the Brightwood section of DC. I'm going to tell you just a little bit about my personal background, a little bit about the school history, our practices, and how we're working towards increasing the internal capacity to accelerate student achievement at our school. I do want to stress that this is really just a practitioner's approach to this. I am boots in the field. We do this work every day. I'm a really, very much a blue-collar girl. I roll my sleeves up and I do the work that has to be done. However, I am a recent graduate of Georgetown. I was a member of the first cohort of principals and a central office staff member that came through Georgetown's Executive Masters in Leadership program. So I'm very grateful to Georgetown professors and to DCPS for giving me that opportunity. Other than that, though, I was teaching for 2 years. I'm a career switcher. I went into actually pharmaceutical and medical sales for 16 years plus. So I went from teaching fifth graders about the cardiovascular system to teaching doctors how to use cardiac medicine. And after 16 years of kind of getting beaten down through the whole sales cycle, and you're only as good as your last sale, and following numbers and sales figures and a lot of travel, I decided to go back to where my heart really was, which was teaching, thinking that teaching was the way I left it 16 years prior, only to find out very quickly that that wasn't true, and trying to dodge the numbers game was not happening because, as you know, education today is all about accountability and data and following numbers. So at least I had 16 years of solid experience in looking at data and numbers, and I use that now in my practice today. So as a career switcher, happy to be back in the educational field. I taught for 1 year in a suburban school. It was vacation. Then I went to an urban school, City of Richmond public school system as a 4th and 5th grade teacher. Got my master's, moved into an administrative position there, and then came to DCPS. This is my 4th year as principal in DC. And I was going to save this quote for a little bit later, but I do want to say that I'd like to quote Chancellor Henderson, who says, "This is not your daddy's DCPS." And I want to say that now because I could not believe that when somebody asked a question earlier that the superintendent of Arlington actually said, "We're doing something that DCPS is doing," because you wouldn't have heard that 5, 6, 7 years ago. DCPS was really struggling, a lot of challenges, but because of the reform efforts that have been made, politics aside, by Chancellor Rhee and Chancellor Henderson, we are really on the move and doing great things. So Truesdale is an education campus. We serve toddlers to teenagers. We're preschool, 3-year-olds, all the way through 8th grade. I like to say that we serve kids everywhere from diapers to condoms. We deal with those things almost on a daily basis. If you have preteens and teenagers and little ones, sometimes not even 2 years old as they're entering school, we like to do it all. We've increased our enrollment over the last 4 years from 368 students to currently, I have 505. Actually, our enrollment today is 509 students. We're located in the Brightwood Park section of DC, and we're a 99% free and reduced lunch population. We have a very high ELL population, primarily Spanish-speaking families, primarily from El Salvador, and we have a growing Ethiopian population. 4 years ago, our population was approximately 60% African American, 40% Hispanic, and that has flipped and even stronger in terms of having a high immigrant population in our young classes. So our 3 and 4-year-old classes are really about 80 to 90% Hispanic and 10 to 20% African American. So we're seeing a shift. We try to be very culturally and linguistically responsive to the needs of our population and to our families. So this is not your daddy's DCPS. And looking at the shift for school reform, with this first generation of education reform is to bring the schooling sector into the world that pretty much everybody else is operating in. That is, we measure performance and we make judgments. So maybe from having a little bit of a corporate background, this resonated very strongly with me. And looking at our school, looking at the systems that needed to change and the systems that needed to be put into place, we started our reform efforts. So I'll give you a little bit about our scores and where we are. They are not record-breaking. They're not anywhere where we want to be, but we really found that gradual incremental change in student achievement and success is the model that's most sustainable. So, you know, at the classification, the No Child Left Behind, changed from AYP to an index score. So in 2012, we were considered a rising school, which is good, not the best, not a reward school, but rising is good. 47.3 was our index score. Last year, we were 52.7, so we have some moderate growth. And our historic performance over time, if you look at the 07-08 scores and the 08-09, those are the scores that I was walking into with the school, and I thought, you know, that's really not too bad, because you see some DCPS schools are down in the 20% proficiency range in ELA and math, but then you see a little bit of a dip in the score. That time period was when there were different accommodations for special ed students. There was some consideration around the integrity of test scores. So the reality of the school was not really where it was. And now we've had some, with the systems and changes we put into place, we do see some growth patterns that are favorable. So in 10-11, ELA 34% proficiency rates and above, and then 42% in math. Then in 11-12, creeping up to 39 in reading, 47 in math, and this past year, 47% and 52% in math. This year, we are hoping, and I try to hedge my bets a little bit, but we do believe that we're going to be 60% or above. Considering a high SPED population and a high ELL population for right now, that's okay. That's not where we want to stay. That's not the trajectory we plan for our students, but taking kids from where they were when we got there, we're going to live with that and keep pushing forward. Those are not the only metrics that we look at. We're looking at our truancy rates, our in-seat attendance, and suspensions, as well as our enrollment, which I was talking about our enrollment going up. So if you look in the far right corner for you, our truancy rate has dropped considerably. Our in-seat attendance has gone up, where you see the green band for 13-14 year-to-date. We're a little bit behind our target. We're hoping for 95% in-seat attendance. That was a little bit of a lofty goal that I shared with the, not shared, actually committed to the Chancellor for, so we're working very hard to try to meet that. And somebody was talking about, you know, how do you make those changes? I have an attendance counselor that literally goes out to houses and has been in the bedrooms of kids telling them to wake up and get to school. I mean, we are truly roll up your sleeves and do the work. We've got very strong connections with our kids and our families. Our parents know our expectations for them, and thankfully they're responding and they trust us. So that number is increasing. we've dramatically reduced our suspensions. When we first got there, it was, and I say when we, myself and the assistant principal was new. When I arrived in 2010, the school was under total construction. I got handed a hard hat on August 5th. There was no, obviously the principal was gone, the assistant principal was gone, the instructional soup was gone. Very few folks were left standing in this building, so there was no culture or any evidence of the school to go by, so we just started building from the information we were able to get. We did hear lots of horror stories about the kids, but I have to tell you, when kids have a lot of monitoring and a lot of structure in place and a lot of intentional work towards their behavior, they respond. So we've been able to reduce our suspension rate quite a bit. It's not exactly where we want it to be, but we're working on it, and the culture and the happiness factor at the school has gone up a lot as well. So we're looking at just tracking some simple measurements to improve student performance. So looking at the increased attendance and reducing the suspension rate has increased our academic performance. The kids are not at school, they're not learning. We know that. So when we have kids that have not followed school rules, we look at alternatives to suspension and we put them in place. So kids are staying in school and staying in class. And again, we've taken extreme measures. We think outside the box. As Rick Hess, your co-author, we consider ourselves cage buster leaders, and we do what it takes to get kids to school, including going to the houses and physically shaking them, saying, wake up, you've got to come to school. We follow our standardized assessments. District of Columbia DC CAS, that's actually going on today. If you went to a DC school right now, I can guarantee you it's easier to get through security at an airport than it is to get into a DC school. Extreme measures have taken place, which I welcome and I'm happy for, because it really speaks to the integrity of our test scores, so they won't be questioned. You're sort of damned if you do, damned if you don't. You get high test scores and somebody's wondering, how you cheated. So I say tape everything off, put the security measures in place. We welcome that because we believe in what the work our kids can do and the work that our teachers have done. As you know, this is the last CAS. We actually had our last CAS supper last Friday night. DC CAS is being put to rest, and we believe we're moving towards the PARC assessment for Common Core standards. So when we look at the growth, we're not planning on linear improvement. We're looking at these gradual gains, and we're looking at continuing these gradual gains in our testing grades 3 through 8 right now, because kids are where they are, and we want to see that growth happen. However, we're really arming up for our youngest students, doing whatever it takes to make sure that that student population is ready for the rigor and the performance of Common Core. We don't intend to go backwards, of course, so we want to make sure that our scores are increasing, but we know that the real work is with our preschool 3, 4, kindergarten, and first grade students. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the work we're doing in those areas. Just going to check my time. Thanks. So when we first got there, we did triage. We knew that all students needed to be reading on grade level. There's lots of work in the literature talking about creating a vision and a mission, a high priority standards, all those things for your school, and it is essential that you do that. But from what we had when we first got there, we knew that we just needed to shore up the reading practice at our school and make sure that all teachers were reading specialists and knew how to teach reading to our kids, because there was not strong evidence that that was happening. So we went through putting interventions in place, looking at our professional practice, getting teachers to come to work, getting the kids to come to school, focus on the children. This job is really about the kids, not about your own personal issues. It's about the children. And then now we're at the point where we're looking at rigorous standards as well as student mastery and using our assessments as learning. So we're really trying to embed assessment practice. So teachers are taking a very diagnostic look at student achievement and student where they're challenged in their instruction and their learning, and being able to put a prescriptive instructional practice in place. However, we did this past summer and throughout the school year work on our vision. So we are coming up with a vision that we believe in, and that's to be the model school community that transforms children into premier scholars, citizens, and leaders of tomorrow. So we believe in that. We know that this takes really hard work. We know that school reform is hard work. So when we are recruiting and Looking for teachers, we try to almost sell them not to come to Truesdale, because if you come to Truesdale, you have to really be intentional about your work and work hard. So some of the things that we believe in are basic elements. We believe in reading as breathing. It's just as essential to life as air is. You need to know how to read for this world. Writing is water. Writing has now become the new reading with Common Core standards, and we're focused on that. And most of all, it's your mindset. Attitude is everything. So you need to have the right attitudes towards the children when you come to Truesdale. So that's what we do. We recruit for mindset. We believe that we're transforming instruction. We know if we build a better teacher, we can build a better student. Our basis for that is data-driven collaborative instruction, where we do work together. This is sort of the old-fashioned way, teachers working together to place kids in the appropriate reading group, which is great. But we're also very concerned and very intentional with our use of technology and our transformational guided reading, and we also use a Hockman writing process to address the rigor of Common Core standards. So I'm just going to go through quickly for some of the technology accelerators that we use. We are concerned with data overload for teachers. We know that that can be a lot, so we're putting supports in place. This is just one student's individual data on their reading achievement. We triangulate that with some other data that we collect. This is our Mastery Connect. We push towards kids' mastery of standards. We're not about kids getting an F and, you failed, you're out. It's about student mastery and working towards that goal, and we're using several pieces of technology to make sure that that happens. Supports have been in place through several grants, through several initiatives that the district has put in place to support our teachers around that work. This is a heavy lift and a heavy shift for teachers to get to, young and old. The technology that's available now for education and to disaggregate data is strong. We just need to know how to use it well. We keep a laser-like focus on our instructional initiatives, which are simply the guided reading at the level of Common Core, as well as our Hockman writing pilot, which really helps children to learn how to analyze a complex piece of text, learn from the text, learn information from the text, and to be able to make it their own through their writing process. So I'm just going to go through to the end of my presentation to say that with all this work that we've put in, we're in alignment with Common Core standards. For our guided reading, we felt that our reading level for kids was high, but the alignment to Common Core was low, and that's the work that we're doing right now to make sure that the rigor for our youngest kids is in alignment with the expectation of Common Core standards. And the result of that this year alone has been an increase in what we refer to as elite scholars. I charge the staff with having at least 15% of our kids to get accepted to the high-performing DCPS high school, School Without Walls, Banneker, McKinley Tech. I had read an article that DC Prep, a great charter school, I know I'm getting followed up by a charter speaker, which is great, we're charter friendly, but 25% of their kids are going to DCPS elite schools, and I thought that was outrageous. We're a DCPS public school, our kids should be going to DCPS elite high schools. So this year, we just got the results back, 29% of our 8th graders have been admitted to the elite schools, Banneker, McKinley, Czech also not as competitive as the others, but we are very happy that our students have achieved that, and we know that the work is worth it, and we're going to continue to have that number grow.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. I believe next we're going to have Kara Kerwin, who's the president of the Center for Education Reform, and she's going to talk about charter schools. I don't think you need any more of an introduction than that.
No, I don't. I don't.
That's who you are. That's what you're doing.
So I just think we should applaud Marianne one more time because what she's done at Truesdale is pretty amazing. And I do think, to tie it together to what I'm going to talk about with charter schools and the charter sector, is I think DCPS has learned a lot from the charter school sector in how to really apply innovative thinking, giving school leaders some autonomy to make tough decisions and change things up. That's where the charter school sector started and where they continue to be. Whoops, I won't even touch the podium. Okay, all right. So Just quick background on the Center for Education Reform. We were founded in 1993 to bridge the gap between policy and practice. What does that mean? A lot of the debate or discussion around education reform was up here. You know, at an academic level, you know, nothing against AEI and the great work of a lot of the think tanks here in DC, but all of it was being talked about up here. And it wasn't really happening yet at the school level or at the community level or with the parents, the people that most needed to have choices. And so the center was founded to help give those parents a voice. And you know, over time, those movements grew, laws started popping up in states, school choice policies were being adopted, and schools were starting to get open. And the center has always embraced that there's really, you know, a proven formula for an exceptional school. And an exceptional movement of education reform. And that means choice, accountability, autonomy, and equity. So choice, parents should have the right to choose, educators should have the right to choose. Accountability is inherent with that choice. Accountability is inherent with creating sort of a market of choices for parents to choose from. Autonomy, educators need the autonomy to lead and be innovative in their school. And then, of course, equity. We really believe that children should have access to great schools, no matter what their zip code, and no matter you know, what their income level. We also think that equity means that all schools should be funded the same way, and money should really be following children to their schools of choice. So the charter school movement today started in 1991 in Minnesota, and now today there are over 6,000 charter schools operating across the U.S., serving about 2.2 million students. Despite the impression that there's tremendous growth, I would say that growth in the charter school sector has really been at a linear pace over time, and there's a high demand for it to be accelerated in a pretty significant way. There are hundreds of thousands of children on charter school waiting lists across the country, and we're not meeting that demand. Here in DC, it's very interesting. In DC, about 45% of the public school population, yes, charter school students are public school students, are in a charter school. They've made a choice. And they have really helped to bring about significant change in the education landscape. They are outperforming their peers at the traditional public schools, but the great thing about the advent of charter schools in the District of Columbia is they've kind of helped what we call this ripple effect, where now schools like Mary Ann's can have some autonomy to innovate. We're seeing all schools do better. We're seeing all students in the district do better. You know, on the DC CAS last year alone, you know, we saw improvements across all. The charter sector, of course, was outperforming a little bit at a faster rate, but all kids are doing better because of choice and because there is a market where parents are becoming consumers of their children's education. And that's really, really, really important. The other reason why the DC charter school sector has been extremely successful is the strength of its law. Laws and policy really do matter. Laws must stand the test of time and cannot you know, be at the disposal of political whims or policy. Policy is not about people. In the District of Columbia, they have a separate entity called the DC Public Charter School Board that authorizes, monitors, and creates charter schools. They actually work with charter schools to make sure that they're being successful. They're also not afraid to shut them down or put them on a different path if things are not working. And they are one of the highest quality authorizers in the country. Other states that we rank really high in our annual rankings of charter school laws include those that allow for multiple authorizers, where you have school districts having the ability, where you have public universities. The universities have been a tremendous innovator in creating great quality K-12 schools. SUNY, we've heard a lot about the charter school movement in New York recently, right? Those successful schools are a result of SUNY's oversight of them. The State University of New York has the ability to authorize and approve charter schools. Meanwhile, New York also allows the local school boards and the state board to also authorize schools. So there's sort of choice even among the authorizers. DC, of course, only allows the DC Charter School Board. And then, we believe that when you have stronger laws, we see more schools and more quality schools opening up. The states that we rank A and B on our annual ranking of laws see increased growth in the charter school sector. And they're not afraid to shut schools down that aren't working or turn them around or give them over to somebody else. That's the really important part about the sector, is that we can't be afraid to hold schools accountable and school leaders accountable. We should be looking at either closing them down or turning them around to focus on student outcomes. I think where the charter school sector has really stimulated the accountability discussions that we have today is that it's sort of not, it's not based in sort of this protectionist manner that we've always looked at our traditional school system. It's not necessarily about some building or some school, it's about the children. And if they're not serving the children, they're held accountable, they're closed, or they're handed over to somebody else. That's really, really important for this whole accountability and quality debate. And we can't be afraid to change things or shut something down if it's not working. That's important. It sounds very free market. Some people might say it's not really practical. But if parents are choosing, again, choice is, the accountability is inherent in that choice. If everybody's choosing one type of school, come on then. Let's go create more of those schools. Let's not, hinder what parents are trying to choose for their children. Parents actually know their children a lot better than most of us do. And if we aren't empowering them, if we aren't educating parents to be educated consumers of their child's education, then we're not really serving our communities very well. Generally speaking, in terms of charter schools and what has made them successful across, I just want to kind of touch on a few high-level demographics. There's a lot of information out there where they say that charters really aren't achieving or they're claiming the best.
It'll stop.
Okay, got it. All right. Sorry. But contrary to that belief, charter schools primarily serve students that come from low-income communities and, have special ed needs, or they have, English as a second language as primary. Some of the children are primarily in those categories. They also can't cream. They are open enrollment public schools where if they do not have enough space, they have to perform an open lottery. So they're not creaming, they're not trying to find the best students or academically rigorous or those who have more grit. They have to accept everybody, and then if they don't have space, they have to perform a lottery. Free and reduced lunch is a common proxy for looking at income levels or poverty, and while a lot of charter schools don't necessarily participate in the free and reduced lunch program, and so that has helped to sort of push that myth forward that they're creaming or they're not serving that population. Charter schools don't necessarily work in the free and reduced lunch program because that program requires them to hire administrators just to administer it. So it's not really cost effective, but they are serving those populations. Demand for charter schools, like I said, there are hundreds of thousands of children on waiting lists across the country. The average charter school waiting list is about 300 students. And so clearly, for us to meet that demand, we need to be looking at the states that have really good policy, that hold schools accountable, that allow for autonomy for the educators, and that allow for parents to have lots of choices, and of course, that are funded equitably. But we need to be looking at those states to learn what we can be doing better in other states so that we can grow the charter school sector, grow the choice sector, support all schools. And while I'm talking about charters, we really do believe that parents need to have a huge portfolio of choices. So that needs to include great public school options, traditional public school options. They need to have a choice between charters. They need to have choices around, some private school options as well. What about blended and new technologies? Those are all choices that parents need to have a portfolio of, and they should be allowed to choose no matter, the tax status of that particular school or whatever. Once we see parents really choosing, accountability is inherent. It's about like anything else that we do in American culture. We make choices every single day, and if those choices were the wrong ones, we do something about it. We're consumers in everything else except for our children's education. And that choice drives quality. Making choices in every other sector of American life drives quality. We don't allow that in our public education system, and we should. And we've seen great results, great examples in the very small but growing charter school sector. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. Next up, we have Lindsay Tirico, who is the Director of Policy and Advocacy at the United Way Worldwide, talking about developing effective education advocacy campaigns.
Okay, well, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Lindsay Tirico. As was mentioned, I work at United Way Worldwide, and also as I like to think of myself, a recovering Capitol Hill staffer. But I've been at United Way Worldwide for about 4 years now. Many of you may know United Way is the largest private charity in the U.S. and across the world. We have 1,200 United Ways across the country, 1,800 around the world. We're in 40 countries. And our goal is really to improve lives. We work with business leaders, we work with community-based organizations, we work with schools to address education, income, and health goals in communities. And advocacy is a really important part of our work. Our tagline is to give, advocate, and volunteer. And this is a call to action for people to get involved in education, income, and health issues. And we see advocacy as one of those key opportunities to do that. So I'm going to start in 15 minutes or less. Talk about our work in education, but also talk about the value of advocacy and the role it plays. And Kara actually touched on this a little bit, so thanks for teeing that up for me. And we'll also talk about some of the best practices for doing advocacy work. So again, advocacy we see as a key part of our work at United Way. We have been working, I would say, for the past 15 years on advocacy, and we got involved in this space because, I think most importantly, because we had to. We realized that there were policies affecting children and youth, and if there's this phrase we use in Washington, if you're not on the table, you're in the menu, because whether we want to get involved in this work or not, it's impacting people in local communities, it's impacting schools, and so we've got to see how we can use policy as a force for good in communities and not a force for evil. The other thing is that when we think about the big, hairy problems in communities, we've realized that we cannot address them through fundraising or through programming alone. Those things are important, but if we think about a lot of the systemic issues happening in communities, there are root causes and issues that cannot be addressed simply by creating another after-school program or coming up with a strategy for addressing middle school transitions. All of that is important, but it's not the only solution. I want to read actually a few statistics because I think this makes the point really well. 2 out of 3 8th graders cannot read proficiently. Nearly 2/3 of 8th graders scored below proficient in math. Nearly 3 out of 4 8th and 12th grade students cannot write proficiently. For African American and Hispanic students across the country, dropout rates are close to 40%. less than half of American students, 46%, finish college. For the first time, most Americans think it is unlikely that today's youth will have a better life than their parents. Only 4% of Americans raised at the bottom of the economic ladder will rise to the top as adults. And nearly 2/3 of African Americans who grew up in middle-class families will fall to the lower rungs as adults. And again, I think this paints the picture that, there's so much that we can do in the school system, and there's so much we can do, through funding and other efforts, but advocacy has to be a key part of this work as well if we want to change these statistics. I want to say really briefly, there are, what's happening on the federal level in terms of policy. There are about 7 or 8 key bills right now that are languishing. And that's why Bill's looking particularly sad on the step there. And what I have here is I've written the bill, and I've also written the last time they were reauthorized. So as you may know, every 4 or 5 years, bills need to be reauthorized. They continue to get funding, but there are no policy changes that happen. And so, of course, when a bill is authorized, there are unintended consequences, problems, concerns. And so you need to reauthorization is an important way to get those changes instituted. Child Care Development Block Grant, I'll say quickly, was last reauthorized about 20 years ago. This is the major bill that funds child care programs in the United States. And so there is some recent movement on that. It passed in the Senate recently. It's a bipartisan proposal, but we're waiting to see what will happen in the House. But I just want to put this up because I think it shows that there's an opportunity here. I mean, right now we are looking to Congress to move these pieces of legislation, but they will only do that if folks in the community put pressure on them. And so advocacy campaigns are a really important opportunity for us to influence policymakers and tell them this is unacceptable. We need to move on these bills. So at its core, advocacy is about changing behavior, changing attitude, and changing policies. It's not about engaging people or advocating on the just for the sake of advocating. You want to actually do something specific with that. There's an art and a science to it. The science part is what we say are the 3 Ps, policy, politics, press. Policy is what is the proposal you're trying to get across. Politics are the people. Who are you engaging and how are you engaging them? And then the press is how are you getting the media to validate what you want to say. And then the art, I think, is the fun stuff because that's how do you make it work every day? I don't know if any of you see that show, House of Cards. That, to me, is the ultimate sort of watching the sausage being made television show. And, of course, it's a little bit extreme and sensational, but, those are the tactics you're using to make it work. I'm not going to go through all of these, but I wanted to mention a few of the education advocacy campaigns that I think are really have been really effective. I'll quickly hit on the first one, which is the Strong Start for America's Children campaign. And this came out of a statement that President Obama made at the last State of the Union address, saying that he wanted to expand preschool. And so a group of education organizations came together and said, how do we make this happen? So they started thinking about the policy. And so they came together, started talking to members of Congress, started talking to potential champions, and they were able to get a bill introduced. Then they started thinking about the politics. Well, how do we get people engaged in this? So they created a website and they put together a pledge where they asked people to just raise their hands and say, I believe in this, I think this is an important issue. And so they started collecting email addresses and identifying opportunities for people to get involved, convening meetings and conference calls to keep them updated on what was happening. And then they thought about the press strategy too, and what I think was really smart about what they did is they thought about how do we get unusual suspects into this work. And I think an important way for us to think about influencing the press is not just what we're saying, but who the messenger is, because that can be the part that media outlets really care about. So they thought about business leaders. They have clout. They have influence. So they had a 50-state strategy where they looked to organize op-eds in every single state in the country. And each state, they tapped an organization in that community and asked them to get business leaders to write op-eds, and they were able to do that in every single state. So it was a really influential strategy, and at the end of the day, they were able to get increased funding for early childhood, a $1 billion increase in Head Start in the last budget, in a bill that we were told there's no new money, and a $250 million new program, state federal match for early childhood. So it's amazing to see what they were able to accomplish. Really quickly, key elements of an advocacy campaign. Obviously, it starts with the issue, making sure you analyze it and have a thorough risk analysis, developing champions, identifying who's with you, who could potentially be with you on the issue, coalition building, which to me is the most important thing, but is also the hardest aspect of this work, because there's territorial issues, there's ownership issues, which organization is getting the credit, but at the end of the day, coalition building can be really effective when done well. Grassroots organizing, public outreach, how are you engaging people, how are you engaging government, having a comprehensive communication strategy, and then also tying into efforts. One of the things that the Strong Start campaign did was they looked at the calendar and they identified key moments during the year. So for Valentine's Day, they did a Have a Heart Congress, Support Kids campaign, and they did something similar for the State of Union address. So it was a really important thing to do. And then creating collateral materials. Best practices, I won't go through all of these, but again, it's about identifying something that's winnable, actionable, provides people with tangible ways to get involved. We like to say passes the T-test, it touches people's lives, they see that they have a stake in it, it enthuses them, it motivates them, and there's a call to action. So I wanted to get really concrete about what this means. So when I first started doing this work at United Way, I was wondering, well, is there a handbook for how to do advocacy? Because I was coming in doing nonprofit advocacy, and I was just sort of making it up as I went along. And I had an idea of what worked and what didn't, but it was really trial and error. So there actually is a book and a whole sort of field of study around this. The Midwest Academy puts together trainings, and they have a book that they put out every couple of years called Organizing for Social Change, and it has a lot of great information on how to get involved. And they put together this chart, and what they do is they ask people to think about these 5 things as you're thinking about an advocacy campaign. What are your short, your midterm, long-term goals? Who are you? Where is your organization right now? Do you have a budget? What types of capacity resources do you have? Who's with you and who could be? Who are your decision makers? And they really force you to thinking about a person and not just an institution. Very often we think about, well, I want to influence Congress, or I want to influence every person in the United States. But it forces you to get really specific about who that person is, and then the tactics piece. And then I just have, this is the chart, and you can certainly look that up online if you're interested. And then really quickly, I want to mention there are many ways that you can advocate, and I know we have many students in the crowd, so it's good to see all of you. Advocacy is on a spectrum. It's not just lobbying. A lot of times people think advocacy is about lobbying, and then they think, I don't want to have anything to do with lobbying. Advocacy encompasses a broad range of activities. It could, it's everything from voter registration to testifying before a committee to educating the public. So there are many ways that you can advocate, and that's really what I want to leave you all with, that whatever your cause is in education or broadly, that there are multiple opportunities for you to raise your hand and say, this is something I care deeply about. And, either at the high level, it's meeting with your member of Congress or elected officials; at the medium level, writing something in the press; or at the low level, simply, liking a cause or signing on to a petition. So lots of ways to get involved. All right. And that's a last quote to leave you with.
Great. Well, I think it's clear that Lindsay was saying something interesting as more and more people chose to join us. She was like the Pied Piper of people. Welcome everybody who was able to join us during that last extremely engaging piece. Our last presentation for this panel will be Dr. Tom Gage, Professor Emeritus in English at Humboldt State University, who's going to talk about the Common Core and wisdom.
Thank you, Dr. McShane, and let me introduce to everyone here students from around the world who have just arrived last night. They are winners of an essay contest that the youth platform of the Gulan Institute of Houston, Texas holds every year. I have been honored to be a part of that group, and this is the 5th year that we have been here. But these students come from all over the world. From the United States, there are students in public schools, charter schools, and the winner, first place winner, Angelia Miranda, is homeschooled. They have written their essays on the theme, how can public and nonprofit organizations assist students who are disadvantaged? And may I recommend that you read some of their essays. They are outstanding insights coming from South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, Burkina Faso, Turkey, South Korea, Japan, Thailand, Bolivia, all around the world. And so far, the Gulan Institute has brought over 100 students from 38 countries around the world. It's a remarkable organization, and please join me in welcoming our new guests.
How can we read their essays?
That is something that my colleague, Dr. Yaji, might be able to address. He is the coordinator and organizer of this, and I'd like to please give him a hand because of what he has been accomplishing. And Dr. Don Kosh in the back is the director of the Gulan Institute, and I'd like to give him a hand. The title of my talk, my background is I've been teaching for over 50 years. I started in an city school in Oakland, California, and today in retirement I continue to teach, and I live in a small rural town where the mayor of my town is my cobbler. I've also taught in China, I've taught in Syria, I was a Fulbright scholar at the University of Aleppo, I've been a dean abroad in Europe, and so I come to education with a passion and cannot stop teaching. The title of my talk is Sensing Pure Water, Common Core and Wisdom. From Sputnik to the present, reforming education and teacher preparation over the last half century has been influenced more reactively than proactively. Information, knowledge, wisdom. These entail goals of education. Today, the internet provides infinite information, and the global economy fosters marketing of knowledge. These two phenomena impinge upon what happens in the classroom so that the results in terms of student outcomes, though clear and understandable to the public, are deleterious to deep thinking and learning. My remarks today address how students interested in teaching and becoming teachers and young teachers already in the field enter sensing pure water of helping humanity, serving humanity, not in pursuit of materialism. Their motives may encounter realities, though, that cause them to jettison their dreams. A look at the Hizmet movement, which is the movement that is articulated in Houston, Texas in the Gulen Institute, provides some optimism for me after my tenure in this field. And I want to share some of the results of a recent publication of mine, Gulen's Ideas on Education, a Caravanserai of Ideas. I'll refer to some of that as I move along. It's a study of essentially how this philosopher poet from Izmir, Turkey, now living in Pennsylvania, through his words in a parallel way of Mandela, has influenced schools being built all around the world, 800 of them, in some really interesting places, like 18 in Afghanistan, one in Mogadishu. There are hundreds in the United States tied up with public schools and also private tuition-driven schools. But I want to share with you a poem that kind of nails down what I want to get at. It's entitled Wires by Philip Larkin. The widest prairies have electric fences, for although old cattle know they must not stray, young steers are always scenting pure water, not here but everywhere. Beyond those fences, cause them to blunder up against those fences. That shoulder-shredding violence leaves no quarter. Young steers are old cattle from that day, electric limits to their widest senses. Now, what I'm sensing and what I have seen over the last 50 years of my career is, in fact, people with the greatest sense to sense pure water and enter the profession of teaching, in fact, bail out very early because of those fences. Youth interested in becoming educators, as those thousands involved in the Hizmet schools sense pure water and the implicit rewards of personal fulfillment working with human beings in their life. Yet, in the United States, too many with a similar motive have dropped out. In California, according to Schofield's research, the average tenure of an elementary school teacher trained in California is 3 years. 3 years. That is a waste of human capital. What is happening to our schools? And I would suggest that many do so because of the cumbersome innovations imposed by laws drafted by the state and federal governments, by both Democrats and Republicans, who know the clarion call of accountability will ensure victory at the polls and incumbency. It is accountability-driven cost-benefit analysis that is creating for teachers and students facing those teachers an I-it stance. And that I-it stance essentially has taken out of the learning situation the wisdom that Alan Volman talked about a little while ago, which was the I-thou involvement, when teachers are working with students, when the students' parents know the teachers, when the teachers have the time not to prepare for tests. Accountability, if accountability is essentially important only for that test at the end of May, what about what happens with a student who learns and makes critical decisions 15 years, 35 years later? Who's around to calibrate those results, those outcomes? That's what's important. Now, what I want to get at here, I think, is embodied in a wonderful book by William Baumol, an economist at Princeton, who has written Cost Disease. And the subtitle is, Why Are Computers Getting Cheaper When Healthcare is Getting More Expensive? And his point is that the phenomena of technology is magnificent. I am not a Luddite. I won an award-winning book called The American Prometheus on an iBook last year at the New York City Book Expo. So I'm not anti-computers. But technology essentially helps certain fields differently than it helps others. It does not help those kinds of vocations where there is interpersonal engagement, the kind of interpersonal engagement that's so neat, results in the kind of wisdom from the I-thou attuning between teacher and student, between doctor and patient, between hairdresser and clients. We are all looking at these categories that Baumol calls a part of the stagnant economy. as opposed to the progressive economy. We can produce cars very easily today. I was talking to one CEO of Procter & Gamble who said in his factory now there are 2 human beings running the pharmacological production of these pills. Now, that's one area of the progressive economy where the computer and automation has come in and been profitable, whereas the other, more stagnant economy, those involving education, healthcare, the legal profession, the police, all of these realms where interactivity between individuals is so crucial, is being criticized as essentially being unproductive, not getting on to the internet revolution, and in fact are being leaned upon to be accountable to the point that are forcing teachers out of the I-thou stance into the I-it stance. Now, I think that in a way, what I find so remarkable about those teachers in the Hizmet movement is essentially an embracing of what John Fitzgerald Kennedy said 50, 60 years ago. Don't ask what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. I feel that in a way, when teachers are reduced to that test that's coming up, whether they're going to be shining or not, is making what Kennedy suggested impossible. Thank you. Let me read a point that when we talk about education, we're talking about a kind of a career and a performance that is a post-experience good. And a post-experience good is pretty well captured by Francis Bacon in a quote I hope I can find, and I can't. But it's essentially a statement that Bacon made saying that of the knowledges that we engage in, there's satiety in knowledge, but all of the satiety that we see are dissipated after the use of that knowledge, except for knowledge as a form of pleasure that doesn't have satiety. And the quote that I want to, one researcher said that students do not expect when they enter school, because of the post-experience good, they do not expect to be changed. They do not expect that their understanding of the world will change, that their beliefs will be altered, that old interests will be replaced by new ones, that on the day of graduation they will be, as human beings, quite different from the freshmen who entered school some years ago. They attend not as the truly religious attends houses of worship for the sake of an experience that will transform, but rather they go to the school as pious attendants, attend houses of worship for the sake of conformity, social conformity, and habit. But the result is you are changed as a result of the experience. The good comes at the end. And the way our economy operates on the basis of GDP, the good has got to come out in instant outcomes. And we can't really predict what's going to happen as a result of the education that we have. And in fact, what I'm trying to get at is the accountability cost-benefit analysis has essentially brought about changes that necessarily anonymize the student as the other. These are changes in stance from the I-thou to the I-it that antagonize teachers towards administrators. These are changes that alter teachers' attitudes towards students whose test scores now are a source of reward or punishment. That these changes position administrators as accountants desperately trying to cut costs to ramp up scores. The net loss of this I-it sequestration is coherence in student learning and acquisition of knowledge, hence wisdom. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we're going to be able to turn it over to questions here from the audience here in a moment, but I was thinking I would take the host's prerogative or the moderator's prerogative at first and ask a question of my own while all of you perhaps have some time to think that up. So, you know, my question, I'd maybe start with Mary Ann, because I think a tension that was sort of developed throughout all the presentations of this panel was one of pace, right? So all of us seem to recognize that there are inequities, that they are both of opportunity, of outcome, all of these things happen, and there is thus a desire to do something about it. Like, we need to do something. We need to pass this law, or we need to have this accountability program, or open this new school. Yet at the same time, there are costs to change. So every new policy affects real human beings and their lives and changes what they have to do. So as someone who's working on the ground, I was wondering if you could maybe chat for a moment about the pressures that you feel or the experiences that you have, both in knowing firsthand the need for reform, the need for improvement, the need for change, but at the same time working within particular constraints. If you could maybe start with that. Thank you.
So I might be a little bit easier for me because it's my work is defined. I know that I'm in a school that needs reform. I know I'm in a school where kids were not getting the education that they needed. So it's a little bit easier then because that work is urgent. And these are kids that when you put high quality instruction in place, the kids respond. So that's sort of a simple model to follow. And you know, that goes from the structures and the systems in school. That doesn't cost anything more. It doesn't cost any more to set an environment where all kids are considered to be able to learn at a high level. In my school, again, it's somewhat easier, I think, because of having the ELL population that may have been disenfranchised for a while. And we do wrestle. We wrestle a lot with, is this a language difficulty that a child is experiencing, or is this, some inability to learn at a higher level. And what we have found repeatedly over and over again, that it may be temporary language, but when we keep putting good practice and good instruction in place, we see that wash away very quickly, especially when we're talking about the younger students. And I forget the panelist's name, but on the first panel, I would even go as far as saying that some of our kids that are coming in at that level are actually have the capacity to be even brighter. I don't know what bilingualism does to the brain, but I think there's research out there. I would say that they're actually in a very good position to learn more. We're introducing Arabic next year at school, and I want to see what trilingualism will do for our students, because I'll have students that will end up trilingual at the end. So, you don't have to do anything fancy, really. You just have to have high quality instruction. And I don't even know that it's any single model that works best. It's just being very intentional about what you're doing and seeing where the kids are, what the kids are learning or not learning, and making sure that you're being very prescriptive in what you deliver back to them.
Outstanding. Thank you. So if one theme that I got from this panel was pace, another one that I think kind of came out in many of these conversations was about change. And so, Lindsay, this is something that I wanted to kick down to you, talking about it from an advocacy perspective. It seems, again, at the same time, here in Washington or in state capitals and districts, a desire to want to do things, seeing in inequitable situations, causes people to advocate for particular policies. But then I tend to find like the tendency is then to just then move on to the next thing. So it was like in education policy here in Washington, D.C. in the early to mid 2000s, it was No Child Left Behind and testing and accountability programs, what Dr. Gage was talking about. And then sort of in the middle of the decade, especially, and towards the late, as President Obama was elected, we saw a lot on teacher evaluation, accountability, the Common Core standards, and now a couple years after that, we're seeing a big push for pre-K and all of those things. And I wonder about that sort of advocacy's responsibility to not only push for that next great thing, but then to continue to work in things that you've sort of advocated for in the past. I was wondering if you could sort of speak to that.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I tend to think that we in Washington have short-term memory loss. I'll talk with some of my colleagues in the field who have been around the advocacy block for a while, and we'll have these conversations about, well, kids really need X, Y, Z, or this policy is the right thing, and they'll say, yeah, well, it was the right thing 10 years ago when we were working on the same thing. So I think you're right. I do think we sort of bounce from issue to issue, but I do think that there's both short-term and long-term policies. There are times when, you think about the Trayvon Martin tragedy that happened, or you think about some of the incidents of gun violence that recently happened in the country, there are moments in time, or you think about the recession recently, there are these moments in time where it makes sense to act at that particular moment. There's an urgency to it, and so we all have to kind of take off what's currently on our plate and shift to that thing, because there's a window of opportunity there. It's on the public consciousness. Policymakers are thinking about it. So I think there's moments like that, but at the same time, we have to think about what's the long game. What do we look like, and what do we want the country to look like long term? And so at the end of the day, we still have those long-term goals, which are, making sure all children have access to a high-quality education, that the community is engaged and supporting student success. And so those are the long-term goals we have to be really clear on. But at the same time, we have to almost have the flexibility to shift when it's necessary to work on that urgent matter that people care about.
Sure. Okay, I could ask these folks questions all day, but I don't know how much you all would enjoy that. So as was stated earlier, I guess I'm one of those DC people with a short memory. So I'm going to be responsible with repeating your question to the crowd. So with that short-term memory, if we could keep that concise, but please, because we're all amongst friends here, if you could introduce yourself to the crowd and then concise question that I can then repeat. Ma'am, please.
Yes. Hi, everybody. My name is Edith Weeks, and I'm a professor of race and ethnic relations, and also of international relations and outer space development. And I'm sure you're wondering why. How does this? So I won't get into that. Just to keep it short, I'm dying to get at those student papers that Dr. Gage mentioned. I'm so afraid I'm not going to be able to tackle the guy and tell me like how to find these papers. However, the reason I'm so interested in these papers is, as I understand that these students are from 38 different countries, and they've written on how to help disadvantaged students. So I'm curious about, are these disadvantaged students in the United States and how to help them, or are they referring to their specific country? I'm dying to know that. And the reason I'm dying to know that is, yes.
So everybody did hear that question. I don't feel the need to. Thank you for projecting. Appreciate it. Dr. Gage, if you could.
These students have written their essays in English, but in every case, I think they're basically talking about the programs in their own nations, although the nations that do pop up as comparison are the United States, Singapore, and Finland. But when I said the number of 38, that's a cumulative over a 5-year period. So we're talking in this group, I think there are 19 different nations represented.
And the reason I'm curious about that is we make reference to African American students. We know there's some sort of statistical problems, and every now and then they'll throw in, and Hispanic, and sometimes they'll mix in immigrant students. But the reasons for these statistics and these disproportionately high numbers that keep showing up never really seems to be explained. And so what we see college students putting nooses around statues of black people on campus or something. That's just one example. We see the Trayvon Martin situation. We see all these things happening in our society, and the young people don't seem to understand why. So my comment is, has anyone, well, I'd just like to say something. I'll do it instead of asking a question. There are historical, economic, ideological discourse, and what I mean by that, the way society tends to think in large ways. The Trayvon Martin situation is happening to just about every African American young person in this country every day, the minute they leave their house, in a subtle way, but we don't acknowledge it. And we're conditioned to believe that there must be something wrong with that person. They're imagining that people won't say hi. Smile practices, elevated behaviors, all these things tend to get reinforced by films, commercials, who gets the deal on the rap with the company to be the rap group and popular and who doesn't. But we tend not to bring these links up. Economics play a critical role in terms of like the students who feel like they're going to make it in society based upon where they live, what that means in terms of who's likely to be at home with them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so I wanted to make that point.
Great. Dr. Gage, I was going to say, Dr. Gage, it seemed like that kind of coalesces with some of what you were talking about in your speech. You have comments or reactions to that?
Well, yes, and maybe to parlay on to the point you brought up earlier. I think it's extremely gratifying to read these papers to get insights into how events occur in this country and are picked up by students around the world, whereas we have kids in this country that don't know what's going on in the rest of the world. Going back a couple of years, 2 years ago, the student who wrote the best paper was from Bulgaria. It's a very interesting array over the 5-year period. There's some wonderful potential research here to explore. But I would like to point out the point about the change that's so important. I mean, research is extremely crucial, and we need to be accountable that's authentic. What I'm seeing are concentric circles of accountability so that you have different audiences. I was with, when Ralph Taylor put the National Assessment of Education Progress together in '72, I was in the first responding group to the findings in literature in 1972. The point that I made at that time is every time you put together goals and objectives and formulate the questions, they are always dated before the first child with her pencil marks the multiple choice answer. Point being, in the Common Core, there is no category for literature today. So the very literature that I was responding to, the literature findings that I was responding to in '72 is no longer even a category. We are always going backwards in terms of testing on these kind of criteria. And with the acceleration of time, I mean, for me in '72 to buy a computer that would generate a MIP, you know what a MIP is? It's 1,000,000 bits of information per second. In 1972, it would have taken me a lifetime and a quarter. In 1997, it would take me, on the basis of my salary, it would take me, in 1997, 27 minutes of my salary to buy that computer. Now, what are we doing? Formulating goals and objectives, you know, in retrospect, and then finding meaningful results at the end? I think the whole accountability movement needs to be tested.
Carrie, you said you wanted to chime in on that.
Yes. I think, so all these themes, we're talking about pace, change, you need flexibility, you need to be able to be varying and intentional. The whole concept of public education, especially in America, needs to be turned on its head. We have to be thinking very differently about how we approach our children, all of our children, and we need to be creating environments where educators can have flexibility, where we can accelerate the pace of change, where we can engage communities in whole new ways, and where we can focus on student outcomes more than the inputs that we're putting into the school. Right here in DC, there is a phenomenal school, and this is how I sort of got into this movement in the first place. I started at the Center for Education Reform as an intern. I was a student at American University. Had no idea what this whole thing was, because actually my state where I came from in Buffalo, New York, had no choice, had no charter schools at that point. And so I was sent down to Southeast to go visit a school. It was a new charter school. They barely had any funding. They didn't have a building. Well, they had a building. It was the Chamberlain, it was formerly a Chamberlain traditional public elementary school. And I was scared out of my mind when I got off the metro and I'm walking around Southeast DC by myself as a freshman in college. Fast forward a few years later, and you see tremendous change in that neighborhood, that community. Because the school, and any school in the United States, if done well, becomes the community hub for that area. And I think we can say that probably anywhere, you know, internationally as well. Schools are about community and bringing communities together. We can change the culture if we change what's going on in the schools. If the educators have the flexibility to do what Marianne's doing at her school. And you can see it, it's demonstrated. So now you go to Friendship Public Charter School at Chamberlain in Southeast, and it's a completely different neighborhood. And you see, but it's still the same community, it's still the same people. But the culture has changed, the culture has shifted. because of a good school. And there are people participating in that school from the community. So that's what education reform really is. It's engaging the community, it's allowing people to have some autonomy, and we have to be changing the mindset that we go into our schools each day.
All right, well, actually, great conversation, haven't included, but I'm getting the hook here. So I think if we could give our panelists a nice round of applause here. Thank you all so much, and I believe the details of what we're supposed to do next are emerging to the front right now. Thank you all so much.